One position for which I will argue tonight is that theists of a certain sort, but not atheists of a certain sort, bear a burden of proof. Although the truth of this position appears obvious to many, a number of Christian philosophers like Eldon Flanagan and Ralph McInerney have denied it. So perhaps I will not waste our time by arguing for it. But just in case, I also plan to argue for several less obvious positions as well, such as the position that while naturalists also bear a burden of proof, that burden of proof is not as heavy as the one theists bear. All of my arguments will be based on a new theory of intrinsic probability, a theory that I've been working on since graduate school, but that only recently has reached maturity. Although, how many times have I said that in the back? So let's begin with the definition of intrinsic probability. I didn't get the memo, by the way, that this was an after-dinner talk and I shouldn't get too stuff. But anyways, this is number 1 on your handout. This is the first time I've ever given a paper where I actually wrote the handout first and then built the paper around it. So I hope that helps out. There's 2 sides to your handout, so this is number 1 on the handout. The intrinsic probability of a hypothesis is its probability independent of the evidence we possess for or against it. By evidence for or against a hypothesis, I mean factors extrinsic to the hypothesis, like fingerprints on a murder weapon, that can, in the right circumstances, raise or lower the probability that the hypothesis is true. Some philosophers, like subjective Bayesians, deny that there are objective intrinsic probabilities. I agree that numerical probabilities of this sort are rare, though certainly not non-existent. My position, however, is that comparative ones are common. One of my arguments for the truth of this position, the only one I will have time for tonight, is that there must be such probabilities because otherwise there would be no solution to the new riddle of induction. The riddle can be expressed in the form of a question. How is it that a body of data can make a hypothesis objectively probable even though that hypothesis does not predict or retrodict that body of data better than all competing hypotheses? Clearly there is a correct answer to this question, but a correct answer is possible only if hypotheses have objective intrinsic probabilities. To use a sports metaphor, if 2 sprinters leave the blocks simultaneously, run down the center of their lanes at exactly the same speed, the same direction, and yet one wins the race, then the winner must have had a head start. Similarly, if a hypothesis is objectively more probable than some competing hypothesis, but not because of evidence, then it must have an objectively higher starting or prior probability. And since that objectively higher starting or prior probability does not, we are supposing, depend on evidence, it must be an intrinsic probability. Arguments like this show that objective comparative intrinsic probabilities exist. The next question is how to assess them. The answer is number 2 on your handout. 2 says, the intrinsic probability of a hypothesis depends entirely on how modest the hypothesis is and on how coherent it is. This is my theory of intrinsic probability in a nutshell. It consists of 3 postulates: that intrinsic probability depends on modesty, that it depends on coherence, and that it does not depend on anything else. Let's consider these postulates in order. The first is that modesty affects intrinsic probability. This postulate has been defended by others, and in any case is fairly obvious once one understands what I mean by modesty. This is explained in number 3 on the handout. The degree of modesty of a hypothesis depends inversely on how much it asserts. Other things being equal, hypotheses that are narrower in scope or less specific assert less, and so are more modest than hypotheses that are broader in scope or more specific. If there are objective intrinsic probabilities, then surely 3 must be true. For surely if we abstract from all evidence, a hypothesis that asserts less and so has fewer ways to be false is to that extent more likely to be true. I'll give just 2 examples. First, the hypothesis that all cats are curious is narrow in scope and so intrinsically more probable than the hypothesis that all animals are curious. Second, compare the hypothesis that either willpower or Forrest Wood will be the 45th President of the United States to the hypothesis that Budweiser will be the 45th President. Budweiser, by the way, is a real person. He's the head of the English department at Purdue, so I'm not The Purdue, or excuse me, the power or would hypothesis is less specific because you have two options, two ways for it to be true, and thus intrinsically more probable than the wiser hypothesis. The second postulate of my theory is that intrinsic probability depends on coherence. Number 4 on the handout fleshes this out. Number 4 says the degree of coherence of a hypothesis depends on how well its parts, that is, its logical implications, fit together. To the extent that the various claims entailed by a hypothesis support each other, the hypothesis is coherent. To the extent that they count against each other, the hypothesis is less coherent. Hypotheses that postulate objective uniformity are, other things being equal, more coherent than hypotheses that postulate variety, either at a time or over time. The claim that coherence affects intrinsic probability, like the claim that modesty affects it, is highly intuitive. For if the different parts of a hypothesis can bear support relations to each other, relations that hold independently of evidence or extrinsic factors, then obviously those support relations will affect how probable a hypothesis is independent of the evidence. Consider, for example, the hypothesis that all crows are black. This hypothesis is identical to the hypothesis that all non-Asian crows are black and all Asian crows are black. Now compare this hypothesis to a second hypothesis, namely that all non-Asian crows are black and all Asian crows are white. The two hypotheses are equally modest, but not equally coherent. The first half of both hypotheses states that all non-Asian crows are black. This supports the second half of the first hypothesis, which states that Asian crows are also black, while it counts against the second half of the second hypothesis, which states that Asian crows are white. The tension in the second hypothesis is one reason why we might use words like although or but or while to connect the two halves. For example, we might say, although non-Asian crows are black, Asian crows are white. Thus, the hypothesis that non-Asian and Asian crows are all black is more coherent and thus intrinsically more probable than the equally modest hypothesis that all non-Asian crows are black and all Asian crows are white. More generally, hypotheses that attribute objective uniformity to the world are, other things being equal, intrinsically more probable than hypotheses that postulate synchronic or diachronic variety, variety at a time or variety over time. Of course, we know by experience that our world displays a great deal of variety at any given time and over time. But it is no accident that the greatest thinkers in history have searched for hidden uniformity behind the variety we observe. And while theologians and philosophers have been unable to prove the existence of greater uniformity either in the past before creation or in the present at the noumenal level, scientists have made a strong case for the existence of much greater uniformity, both in the distant past, just after the hypothetical time of the Big Bang, and in the present at the micro level. Parmenides was wrong to ignore the evidence of our senses, but he was right that his hypothesis was intrinsically more probable than any other. If objective uniformity were not intrinsically more likely than either objective variety at a time or objective change, then Hume's problem with induction would be impossible to solve. Hume's problem, roughly, is that it appears impossible to rationally justify relying on induction. This is because induction is reliable only if nature is objectively uniform in most discernible respects. Thus, to justify relying on induction, one must justify the belief that nature is uniform. Unfortunately, since it is not a necessary truth that nature is uniform, it appears that the only way to justify the belief that nature is uniform is to use induction, to argue that past or observed uniformity is evidence for future or unobserved uniformity. But this would make one's justification of induction circular. The solution to this problem is that, although nature is not necessarily uniform, it is a necessary truth that objective uniformity is intrinsically more probable than objective variety. For example, the hypothesis that all arsenic is poisonous to human beings is intrinsically more likely to be true than the hypothesis that while all observed arsenic is poisonous, all unobserved arsenic is nutritious. Similarly, for you fans of Goodman's paradox, the hypothesis that all emeralds are green is intrinsically more probable than the hypothesis that all emeralds are grue, since the latter hypothesis, unlike the former, postulates objective change, non-language relative. So the reason that it is wise to rely on induction, even though it is not a necessary truth that induction is reliable, is that it is a necessary truth that it is intrinsically probable that induction is reliable. I should add, just in case you were worried, that although Hume's problem of induction is not generally considered to be a part of philosophy of religion, my solution to it is included in the $49.45 that you paid for dinner tonight. Please direct all requests for partial refunds to the treasurer, care of the secretary as always. The third postulate of my theory is that intrinsic probability does not depend on anything else besides modesty and coherence. To see the plausibility of this third postulate, keep in mind that we are talking about probability independent of all evidence, of all factors extrinsic to the hypothesis that affect its probability. Then ask yourself, what else could the intrinsic probability of the hypothesis depend on, besides how little that hypothesis says, its modesty, and how well what it says fits together, its coherence? I'm not trying to use a rhetorical question as a substitute for an argument. My students are experts at that. But the point of this question is to highlight the scarcity of serious candidates for a third determinant of intrinsic probability. There is, however, one famous candidate that is serious, and that is simplicity. More specifically, Richard Swinburne and others have defended the view that the intrinsic probability of a hypothesis depends in part on how simple its simplest formulation is. He gives many examples from science that appear to strongly support this claim. Notice, however, that there is an interesting difference between his theory of intrinsic probability and mine. On the one hand, examples are not necessary to see, or at least seem to see by rational intuition, that modesty and coherence must affect intrinsic probabilities. Hence the oddness of asking why hypotheses that risk less by saying less or by saying things that support each other have higher intrinsic probabilities. One appropriate response seems to be, duh. Right? Or another seems to be, can't you just see by rational intuition that this is so? Swinburne's theory, on the other hand, has greater need of support from examples because it lacks support from rational intuition. There's nothing odd about asking why a contingent fact about our language, namely the fact that one hypothesis can be given a simpler formulation in that language than another, is a good reason for believing that the former hypothesis is intrinsically more probable than the latter. Concerning this last question, however, there is some good news and some very bad news for Swinburne. The good news is that a good answer to this question is available that is only slightly corrective. The very bad news is that this answer actually undermines his theory instead of supporting it. The answer to which I refer is this. Typically, that's the slightly corrective part. Typically, simpler hypotheses are intrinsically more probable than complicated ones, because typically, the more modest and coherent a hypothesis is, the simpler its simplest formulation in either natural or mathematical languages will be. For example, the hypothesis that all non-Asian crows are black and all Asian crows are black can be formulated more simply as all crows are black, while the hypothesis that all non-Asian crows are black but all Asian crows are white cannot be formulated as simply, unless, of course, we invent bizarre new color words that, surprise, surprise, are not a part of any natural language. More importantly, though I won't have time to demonstrate this tonight, all of Swinburne's examples from science can be explained in terms of my two criteria of modesty and coherence. Thus, the exalted principle of simplicity turns out to be just a good rule of thumb. It is a reliable indicator of intrinsic probability only because, and only to the extent that, simplicity is correlated with modesty and coherence. Since no commentary or discussion follows this talk, I can now safely assume that you all accept my theory of intrinsic probability. The next question is this. What is the connection between intrinsic probability and burden of proof questions? The answer to this question is given in number 5 on your handout. 5 says, I take questions about burden of proof to be questions about whether hypotheses need evidence make them probable. Such questions are relative to stages of inquiry. Prior to all inquiry, they are best understood as questions about intrinsic probability. If a hypothesis is intrinsically improbable, then those who believe it to be true bear a burden of proof in the sense that acquiring evidence is, or was, necessary in order for the truth of their belief to be more likely than its falsity. This is not how everyone interprets burden of proof questions, but it is certainly a natural interpretation, especially for philosophers. And it is the interpretation I will presuppose in this paper. Now let's turn to the three metaphysical hypotheses about which I want to ask burden of proof questions. On your handout, these are numbers 6, 7, and 9, which I will explain without reading. Actually, I won't explain the numbers, but I will explain the hypotheses right. The first two are naturalism and supernaturalism. If, like me, you believe that concrete reality includes a private, subjective mental world and a public, objective, physical world, then you should take seriously the position that one of these two worlds explains the existence of the other. There are, of course, two versions of this position, one of which I call naturalism and one of which I call supernaturalism. Naturalists claim that the physical world causally explains the existence or apparent existence of the mental world. I add or apparent existence so that the limited to materialists can count as naturalists. Believe me, you do not want to tell an limited materialist that she is not a naturalist. Scientific naturalists add to the naturalism the claim that the explanation in question is a scientific one, and in particular a covering law explanation. Of course, scientific naturalists don't know exactly what that explanation is. They don't know what the laws are that explain why matter, when arranged in a certain way, for example in the form of a functioning nervous system, brings mind, or apparent mind, into existence. But scientific naturalists must hold that there are such laws. Supernaturalists claim that it is the mental world that has priority. According to supernaturalism, the physical world, or making room for a limited of idealists, its appearance, is a product of one or more non-physical mental entities. Personal supernaturalists add that the mental entities in question are persons, and that the explanation of the physical world is teleological or purposive. Of course, personal supernaturalists need not claim to know what purposes were being pursued when the physical world was created, but they must hold that there are such purposes. Now consider number 8 on the handout. Clearly, it is not certain that either naturalism or supernaturalism is true. For example, some sort of panpsychism might be true, according to which concrete reality consists of a single sort of stuff that essentially has both physical and mental aspects. Or perhaps something that transcends all other most general categories, and so is neither physical nor mental, is the ultimate cause of both physical and mental reality. Let's group together all these non-naturalist and non-supernaturalist alternatives under the single banner of otherism. A lot of others here tonight, I know that. Finally, number 9 on the handout tells us that metaphysical theism, and again, I use the word metaphysical as the adjective here because I don't assume that this is traditional theism. I don't assume any particular connection to any particular religions like Christianity or Judaism or anything like that. So number 9 tells us that metaphysical theism is a form of supernaturalism, and in particular a form of personal supernaturalism. It identifies the mental reality responsible for the existence of physical reality with God. In other words, with a unique person who is omnipotent and omniscient, and thus lacking non-rational desires, omnibenevolent as well. With these definitions in hand, I am now ready to present my 3 main arguments, which are 10, 11, and 12 on your handout. Let me begin by reading the first sentence of 10, because if you accept 2 on the handout, which states my theory of intrinsic probability, and also the first sentence of 10, and the arguments in 10 and 11, although not 12, are slam dunks. 10 says, or the first sentence of 10 says, supernaturalism and naturalism are equally modest and equally coherent. A full defense of this claim is impossible tonight. Hopefully, however, it will suffice. The key point, of course, is that supernaturalism and naturalism are perfectly symmetrical claims. One says that the physical causally explains why anything mental exists, and the other says that the mental causally explains why anything physical exists. This symmetry provides strong prima facie justification for believing that they are equally modest. Neither one seems to be more specific than the other, neither one seems greater in scope. They seem just flip side of each other. Further, short of trying to revive the discredited view that all claims about the mental are identical in meaning to claims about the physical, but not vice versa, it is hard to imagine how one could argue that these 2 claims are not equally coherent. I suppose someone might try to argue that there is something about the mental or about the physical that can be known independent of all evidence, and that makes one of them unsuitable to play the role of ultimate cause. It's hard to see, however, how such an argument would go, since independent of all evidence, there's nothing, or at least nothing I can think of, about the mental or the physical that makes one more likely than the other to have the required causal powers. Now that the first sentence of 10 has been defended, I'll read both 10 and 11 in their entirety. 10 says, supernaturalism and naturalism are equally modest and equally coherent. Thus, given two, they are equally probable intrinsically. Further, supernaturalism, naturalism, and otherism are obviously mutually exclusive, and the falsity of otherism is not intrinsically certain. Hence, supernaturalism and naturalism each have an intrinsic probability of less than 1/2, which means that their denials are each intrinsically probable. Therefore, prior to inquiry, both supernaturalists and naturalists bear a burden of proof, while those who deny either of these hypotheses bear no such burden. The argument 11 says, metaphysical theism entails personal supernaturalism, but is not intrinsically certain given supernaturalism. Because there's other versions of supernaturalism that take up some probability space. Thus, metaphysical theism is less probable intrinsically than supernaturalism. Therefore, since supernaturalism and naturalism are both intrinsically improbable and equally so, it follows that, prior to inquiry, metaphysical theists bear a burden of proof that is heavier than the burden of proof that naturalists bear. While metaphysical atheists, that is, those who believe that metaphysical theism is false, bear no such burden of proof at all. Bill Rowe just sat up a little straighter in his seat as if a burden were suddenly lifted from his shoulders. Maybe that is about to make the door. After a full day of listening to papers and a large dinner, and well, actually this room is different than the one we've had in the past. What I wrote here was thinking of that room we used to get. And a large dinner in a dimly lit, sleep-inducing room. These arguments may sound complicated, but in reality they are almost childlike in their simplicity. Childlike in the sense that bright colors are all that is needed in order to make them comprehensible. As I mentioned earlier, if the two italicized claims in your handout are true, namely number 2 and the first sentence of number 10, then everything else is easy. To demonstrate this, I'm going to ask you, and I really do this, okay, this will help. Everything about probability anything you say about probability can be said in terms of proportions of space taken up, right? That's why probability theory is a part of measure theory. So now, I'm going to ask you to imagine that the tablecloth is removed from your table, revealing that the top of your table is painted 3 bright colors. Part of it is yellow, part is red, and part is blue. Let's let the yellow part of the tabletop represent otherism. Then the red part can represent naturalism because nature is red in tooth and claw. And because any reasonable person should hope that supernaturalism is true, and Obama represents hope, and Obama's a Democrat, states that vote for Democrats like Indiana are blue states. The blue part of your tabletop can represent supernaturalism. You got that stuck in your head, right? That was my shirt. Further, the proportion of the tabletop painted blue, how much proportion of your tabletop is painted blue, that will represent the intrinsic probability of supernaturalism. And similarly for the proportions of the tabletop painted red and yellow. So, for example, if less than half of the tabletop is painted red, then that will represent the fact that the intrinsic probability of naturalism is less than 50%. Now, with this new with these bright colors as assistants, consider the argument in 10 again. If I'm right that supernaturalism and naturalism are equally modest and equally coherent, then given my theory of intrinsic probability, then they must be equally probable intrinsically. But that means that the proportion of your tabletop that is blue is equal to the proportion that is red. But there's also some yellow on your tabletop because otherism is not certainly false. Thus, the red region and the blue region must each take up less than half the table. And thus, supernaturalism and naturalism must each be intrinsically improbable. That is, intrinsically less likely to be true than to be false. But given how I understand burden of proof questions, this means that supernaturalists and naturalists each have a burden of proof. Moreover, since the part of your tabletop that is not blue is more than half of the tabletop, as is the part that is not red, those who deny supernaturalism and those who deny naturalism do not have a burden of proof. They don't need evidence to expand the proportion of the tabletop that they cover. That's how simple the argument in 10 actually is. Now for the argument in 11. Metaphysical theism is a version of supernaturalism, but it's not the only version of supernaturalism. It's not the only version of supernaturalism that takes up space on your tabletop. We can suppose then that the blue part of your tabletop has both royal blue and baby blue areas. Let the royal blue area represent metaphysical theism. That seems appropriate, unless, of course, you strongly associate God with baby Jesus, in which case you may want to let the baby blue area represent metaphysical theism, but I'm going to go for royal blue. Guess that's the color of shirt. Since the entire blue area is less than half the tabletop and equal to the red area, the royal blue area, the metaphysical theism area, must also be less than half the total area and smaller than the red area, which means that metaphysical theism is intrinsically improbable and intrinsically less probable than naturalism. And so metaphysical theists bear a burden of proof, and that burden is heavier than the burden of proof that naturalists bear. Okay. Metaphysical atheists, which I define as those who believe that metaphysical theism is false, clearly have no such burden, because far more than half the tabletop is not royal blue. Of course, metaphysical atheism, as I define it, is compatible with views that no typical self-described atheist would accept, like non-metaphysical versions of theism. But even if we identify atheism with the denial of all forms of supernaturalism, my arguments still show that atheists do not have a burden of proof. If, however, we identify atheism more specifically with naturalism, then my arguments show that atheists do have a burden of proof. So it all depends how you define atheism. Now let's look at my third argument, which is stated in number 12 on your handout. This argument is more adventurous than the other two, and more important in a way. More important practically for me, anyways. Number 12 says, once inquiry reveals the existence of both mental and physical worlds, supernaturalists bear a heavy but not extremely heavy burden of proof. Further, metaphysical theism is a relatively modest and spectacularly coherent form of supernaturalism. Partly for this reason, it is not extremely improbable intrinsically given supernaturalism. Thus, while the burden of proof that metaphysical theists bear is very heavy, maybe even extremely heavy, it is not hopelessly heavy. The first point here is that once we know or take into account that the mental and the physical exist and they interact with each other, otherism no longer dominates the tabletop. It is at this stage of inquiry that the red and blue regions become easy to see and perhaps even cover, when combined, more than half the tabletop. That's represented in the diagram on your handout. In other words, given that concrete reality includes both the physical and the mental, and that each influences the other, it is reasonably likely that either the mental came first and explains why anything physical exists at all, or the physical came first and explains why anything mental exists at all. Assuming I'm right about that, what should we say about metaphysical theism? How much of the blue region is royal blue? There are infinitely many alternative versions of supernaturalism. Should we conclude that the royal blue region is infinitesimally small? I believe that the answer to that question is no, because I believe that both personal supernaturalism is not very unlikely given supernaturalism. It's a very natural view. And that metaphysical theism is a relatively modest and spectacularly coherent version of personal supernaturalism. Why do I believe this? First, attempts to show that metaphysical theism is logically inconsistent have, in my opinion, failed. Second, if a mind, or more specifically personality, is ontologically fundamental, then since any multiplicity requires variety, remember variety bad, right? It is more coherent to suppose that a single mind is involved in multiple minds. And it is also more coherent to suppose that this mind will exhibit uniformity in its powers and capacities than to suppose that it will exhibit variety. Thus, it is more probable intrinsically that it has no non-logical limits to its power and knowledge, and only rational desires, and then that it can create some creatable things and not others, or that it knows the truth value of some knowable propositions but not others, or that has non-rational desires that could influence it to act in a way that it knows to be bad. In addition, the statement that this person is omnipotent supports both the statement that she is omniscient and the statement that she lacks non-rational desires, for the very simple reason that an omnipotent being that is not omniscient could make itself omniscient and could eliminate any non-rational desires that she had. I submit that no other equally modest form of personal supernaturalism can match the coherence of metaphysical theism. Thus, while the royal blue region of your tabletop is no doubt very small, the burden of proof that metaphysical theists must bear is admittedly very heavy. It is not hopelessly small. The burden of proof theists must bear is not hopelessly heavy. So-called new atheists, or brights, if you've heard that, like Richard Dawkins, like to compare believing in God to believing in flying spaghetti monsters or invisible pink unicorns or Santa Claus and so on and so forth. But I reject these comparisons. Pastafarianism and unicornism are not even forms of supernaturalism, and more generally do no important metaphysical work at all. Not to mention that Pastafarianism is very specific and thus immodest. For example, why spaghetti instead of linguine or rigatoni or lasagna or macaroni? My daughter always listens to this Sesame Street song that has, 40 different kinds of pasta. And unicornism is maximally incoherent, even ignoring the fact that there is significant tension between being pink and being invisible. Unicorns are, by definition, imaginary creatures, and so no existing thing could count as a unicorn. The intrinsic probability of unicornism, not to mention fairyism and leprechaunism and Santa Clausism, is zero. Another rhetorical strategy used by brights like Dawkins is to accuse Christians and other monotheists of being just a hair's breadth away from atheism, because they reject the existence of every single God that anyone has ever believed in, except for one. The suggestion, of course, is that it is impossible to justify such a remarkable exception. If, however, metaphysical theism is an unusually modest and coherent form of supernaturalism, and especially if it has more explanatory power than other modest and coherent forms of supernaturalism, which is arguable, then a single exception when it comes to believing in gods is certainly far less arbitrary than brights like Dawkins thinks. This may help to explain why a humble agnostic, or as I like to say, a brilliant, told that metaphysical theism should be taken seriously. With due respect to all of the atheists and their free-thinking followers, metaphysical theism is not just silly superstition. Fortunately, I think most people here tonight, even if they reject metaphysical theism, do take it seriously, or at least seriously enough to attend papers about it. I don't know how much that means.
Especially if they feed us.
It's time for some concluding remarks. Look at 13 on your handout. 13 says, I am neither a metaphysical theist nor a naturalist, partly because neither theists nor naturalists have, in my opinion, successfully shouldered their burden of proof. It is scandalous, I think, that naturalists these days rarely even try. Theists, while almost never admitting that they have a greater burden of proof than atheists, very often try to shoulder that burden that deep down they know they have. Unfortunately, a preference for apologetics or more philosophical or quasi-scientific forms of inquiry dooms many of them to failure. The last sentence of 13 alludes to what I call the paradox of apologetics. If one seeks to justify one's beliefs, instead of seeking to determine whether those beliefs are true or false, then one's inquiry will inevitably be biased, and so no matter how much evidence for one's beliefs one finds, one will fail to justify those beliefs. Unfortunately, too much theistic and atheistic apologetics masquerades as philosophy of religion these days, which should be of great concern to members of this group. Finally, let's look at 14 on your handout. Although I am not a theist, I do have faith in God, sort of. It's funny how adding those two seemingly innocuous little words, sort of, to the end of a sentence can drastically alter one's message. Try saying this to your spouse. I love you, sort of. Definitely not a good idea. But I can see myself on Judgment Day. God will say, you have faith in me, sort of. So you'll spend eternity in a place that is sort of like heaven. At least its name starts with an H. Of course, if the omnibenevolent God of metaphysical theism exists, then obviously there is no place of eternal torment for non-believers.
So maybe I would reply, Lord, I see you're displaying your maximally great sense of humor. Or maybe not. It's probably a bad idea, especially on Judgment Day, to sarcastically call attention to the falsity of perfect being theology. But I digress. I just don't want to talk to him tonight. Since I'm the only one in the room that feels that way, I'll try to. What sort of faith do I sort of have? Like Barack Obama, I suspect, after reading the chapter on faith and the audacity of hope, I have a faith of hope instead of a faith of belief. Now, I don't recommend this sort of faith, except as a last resort. As John Schellenberg once said in a paper delivered to the Society, hope is intellectually bittersweet. Whereas another John, the actor John Malkovich, once said to a group of hopeful children in a Christmas skit on Saturday Night Live, you know, kids, hope is what we cling to, and reality leaves us nothing else. Still, and now, well, that can go, I don't have to say now I want to be serious because you didn't really laugh at the last time anyway. I want to be serious for a moment. For those unable to believe in God, like myself, a faith of hope may be the only way to express love for God. Such faith is justified, I believe, partly because the available evidence is ambiguous. For example, a strong evidential argument from evil against theism is offset by a strong evidential argument from free will in support of theism. Equally crucial, however, for a justified faith of hope, and this was perhaps my most important and controversial point tonight, and it will be my last point as well, is the fact that the intrinsic probability of theism is not negligibly or hopelessly low. Thank you, and may God, or the great rooster, or the leaping linguine monster, bless you, your loved ones, sort of, and the Society for Philosophy.